Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar launch of Paul Bové's new book, Love's Shadow, published by Harvard University Press. My name is Nergie Erturk. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Penn State and have been a member of the Boundary 2 editorial masthead since 2010. And it's my honor and pleasure to moderate this webinar sponsored by Boundary 2. In addition to Paul Bové, we have Colin Dayan, Pease, and Cornel West are here with us today to discuss Love's Shadow. And in terms of format, we'll begin with Paul delivering brief remarks for about 10-15 minutes, to be followed by our discussants who will each speak for about 10 minutes. And their brief presentations will be followed by a question and answer session with all the attendees. You can submit your questions by using the Q&A feature. If you prefer to address the panel verbally, feel free to use the raise hand icon at the bottom and I'll unmute you during the Q&A. Before I pass the baton to Paul, I'd like to introduce each speaker briefly. Paul Bové, our first speaker, is the editor of Boundary 2. In addition to Love's Shadow, his books include Intellectuals in Power and Poetry Against Torture. Currently, he's completing a book on Henry Adams while planning a book on portraiture. He has essays forthcoming on the ethical structure of literary studies, the relation between academic cultural structures and neo-authoritarianism, and is contributing to the University of Pennsylvania volume, celebrating the 25th anniversary of Dr. West's Race Matters. Our second speaker, Colin Diane, teaches at Vanderbilt University in the English department and in the law school. Her books include Haiti, History and the Gods, The Law is a White Dog, The Story of Cruel and Unusual, and most recently In the Belly of Her Ghost and Animal Quintet, a Southern Memoir. Professor Diane's groundbreaking work on the study of prison law, the legal and religious history of the Americas and 19th century American, French, and English literary history has influenced scholars across multiple disciplines, including anthropology, English, and comparative literature. Our third speaker, Pease, is the Ted and Helen Geisel Third Century Professor in the Humanities, Chair of the Master of Arts in the Liberal Studies program, and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Dartmouth College. Professor Pease is an authority on 19th and 20th century American literature and literary theory, and he is founder and director of the Futures of American Studies Institute. He has written numerous books and over 100 articles on figures in American and British literature, and was editor of the New Americanist series, which has transformed the field of American studies. Our fourth speaker, Cornel West, is currently professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and holds the title of Professor Emeritus and at Princeton. As many of you know, in the fall, he will return to Union Theological Seminary, where he taught in the past, and will hold the prestigious Dietrich Bonhoeffer Chair. Professor West is best known for his classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, and for his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. His commitment to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of, in Dr. West's words, telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice, has inspired generations of scholars, artists, and activists in the United States and across the world. It is truly an honor to be with each and all of you here today. And thank you. Paul, would you please unmute yourself to address the panel?
Thank you all very much. Am I being easily heard? Good. I have to begin with thanks, lots and lots of thanks. First and most importantly, I need to thank Nergie, without whom absolutely no moment of what's going on here would have taken place. The very conception of it would have been simply born dead. It would have had no value at all. I need to thank as well the Boundary 2 editorial collective, which has given me permission to do this, and has created for me the first opportunity for any of us to present one of our new books in such a way. I have to thank as well my wonderful and absolutely essential editorial assistant, Alina Zhang, who worked with Nergie in assembling this and from whom many of you probably received invitations. As always, I need to thank Meg Havern, who, as many of you know, is the managing editor of Boundary 2, and without whom literally nothing of Boundary 2 would exist in its modern form. And since this is about Love's Shadow, I need to thank Lindsay Waters, who I think is somewhere there in the ether with us, who was the editor, who made possible this book, who insisted on its being written, who in many ways brought it into being. And of course, finally, I need to thank my friends and colleagues, Colin Dayan and Cornell, for honoring me being here. And I'm sure before the afternoon is over, causing me considerable difficulty. I didn't quite know what to do for these few minutes. You see, I had never read this book. Of course, I corrected the proofs, but as many of you know, correcting proofs doesn't really equate to reading a book. And since the book was written over a very long period of time, it exists over many pages, perhaps too many pages, and it treats many different figures and subjects in discrete but interwoven chapters. I had very little sense of what it was like. So I set out to actually read it. And then in reading it, I was trying to think about how to present it or how to talk with you about it. I honestly very much dislike presentations of books or projects that begin by saying, this is how I did this. This is how it came into being. That is to kind of say a kind of memoirization of the work. So I thought, let me imagine a different way of trying to talk to you about this book. And I remembered that as a younger person, I used to be a frequent book reviewer. So I set myself the rather anomalous task of writing for you a relatively short review of my own book. So I'm going to share with you a book review, something that probably I could have written sitting in Hamilton Hall at Columbia in 1975, at least in mode. So here is that, and I apologize for the tone, because I'm out of practice. Reviewing Love's Shadow over these past few days, I concluded that the book wants and tries to exist as an act of writing with prose that varies in tone, quality, and density. Having realized this, I was then left to ask why the book did this, to what end, with what success. At times, this book bears down on theories of writing appropriate to its genre, which is the critical essay. Chapter 5, for example, called simply Adorno, exists in a prose style recognizable as that of the German 20th century's post-idealist thinkers who, inflected by Marx, but foundationally Hegelian dialectics, practiced abstraction and stylistic introversion to conceptualize historical actions in the most fundamental terms. The chapter then doubles on itself, using the modes reproduced in the style to establish consequences and conclusions for critical intellectual work that explain and authorize along one path the value and necessity of critical writing as a form of creative intellectual freedom. Chapter 5 is the place where Love's Shadow does evident work writing out the entangled qualities and figures of critical thinking as a necessary value for society and for the species. Values and necessity akin to the values and necessities art offers to the species, the society, and the planet. The chapter reshapes the standard material of memory, of remembered critical writing that had come before it, that made it possible by sitting there waiting to be remade. As such, the chapter does not end with a resultant figure that can be carried away as if it were a tool, a concept freed for use. Rather, the chapter shows that the motive for written criticism is not utilitarian. It is not to leave an external residue. It is rather the drama of the work done as style, with memory and invention, leaving itself as work available for continuation by others in reading, in extended exposition, and in development of the encounter. The strangely named chapter, Socratic Interlude, chapter 3, styled differently as a monologic agon, develops as a standard literary critical examination of a central document in the history of European philosophy. It is more aggressive in tone than most close readings of literary works. It develops an argument that Plato's text, when read by a critic and not an academic professional committed to the norms of history of philosophy, it develops an argument that such a text loses its legitimacy as a founding claim for philosophy's unique authority as a way to truth, as the way to truth, and as the path to proper life. Staging the symposium again, as it were, analyzed by a modern literary critic, the chapter stands for poetry over and against philosophy, using the devices of literary criticism to remove the text from the precincts of philosophical assumption. So the chapter presents itself as another agon, a restaging of the first drama in which Socrates displaces all authority and need from cultural practice to the seductive path of enlightenment allegorized by Diotima. The chapter then draws attention to writing as craft, so to correct not only the content claims of the symposium, but also the institutional authority of its philosophical interpreters, and especially its function as an inheritance within reality. Critical writing escapes the control of the Platonic paradigm and gently mocks conventional scholarly borrowers from the extra-literary for its utility in interpreting the world and art to extend their own claims over the same. In the humility of simple explication, then, far from the Adorno-esque claims for imminent reading, textual literary analysis writes out the comic pathos of those who, in the almost forgotten Frank Kermode's words, find philosophy or anything else easier than poetry. As an earlier reviewer noted, this book has its own unconventional shape, its own motility, its own recursive effects. However, the book also moves along with a willed purpose. Its energies appear in writing Rembrandt's Bathsheba, which is chapter 8, before turning to a lower mimetic level of comic and romance resolution in chapter 9. That, solving the tragic problem, turns toward the world that is beyond the threshold, created, staged, and opened by art, and toward which it has delivered itself and wishfully its readers. Demanding that critic and poet sit on the circumference of the human dream, as it does in its account of Stevens, that would contain a human dream that would contain nature, or contain nature remade for the human dream, displaying and echoing, not strong enough to reenact, but displaying and echoing the art of making the human present in a world without God. The writing speeds up as if toward a final claim, namely that Shakespeare himself had overcome the problem Schmidt and Walter Benjamin claimed remained ours as inheritors of the Baroque. And so the book rewrites the Socratic interlude in a new facet of prose, then in another act of recall processes older tropes, prosing the problem and solution of tragedy, so that the book can finish, turned toward the same threshold of an unredeemed world that after Stanley Cavell we see is Paulina's final gift as she turns to her honors at the end of The Winter's Tale. Remember, please, this is a book review, so then I write this. We can lament the book's difficulty at the level of the sentence in various chapters, especially those on Adorno and the Auroras of Autumn. However, even in its most direct and lucid prose, the style makes demands that it has perhaps not earned the right to make. It asks for recognition of precious gestures by other writers and intellectuals. It suggests that writing out the inheritance of its own traditions is a necessary screening of desired direct and final statements. As such, the book poses itself as demanding to be read rather than as a book about, a book making claims, or even a book in conversation with other books. At times, it desires to be a summa, while in fact those moments are merely passing temptations within the essayistic passions of the writing itself. Love's Shadow leaves us nowhere in particular because it cannot sum itself up. It remains therefore vulnerable to several lines of normative inquiry. What is it trying to say? What does it want us to take away from a reading? What about the many things it does not touch, the places where it is incomplete? That is to say, what about this or that? The book demands time, and if we were generous, we could say it leaves us with mysteries and dissatisfactions. It does not achieve its apparent goal, namely to show that the poetic attitude and the critical child are essential to the survival of the species and its habitat. At best, like Paulina herself, it becomes a threshold to what was always there. So in concluding my review, I say this: I do not believe the book is useful for course adoption, and I cannot compare it with other works in the field. Its multiple subjects remove it from most specific fields, and its elevated level of abstraction and dense articulation, combined with detailed analyses of a limited number of objects, suggested will not be especially useful to others working in their own domains. Its elusive style and its varying modes of prose expression make it difficult reading for even professional students who will find few pedagogically useful elements for their own research or teaching. Those who are patient and generous enough to spend time demanded by this book may be disappointed that it fails at its own goal of transport. And yet they may also enjoy moments of transport, those it sometimes finds in scripting facets of its own interests. So in a short time, that was the best I could do in writing a review of a perhaps too long book. So let me thank you all again, and now I will listen and wait.
Thank you, Paul, for that. Professor Dayan, when you're ready, would you please unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you, Paul. I must tell you that after reading the book, I'm going to drag it into the classroom. It will be part of my teaching of the long poem next semester, a graduate class. So I'll let you know how that happens, but it's going to be there. I want to say how glad I am to be here, how wondrous it has been to spend time with this book. And so much came back to me, really. So let me begin there. When I began teaching poetry at Yale in the 80s, I designed a class on the long poem. It included Pound, Eliot, Williams. I was being adventurous and I put in Olson and Blackburn, Adrienne Rich, Judy Grahn, Kamal Brathwaite, and Derek Walcott. John Hollander, a colleague and sometime mentor, frowned and said, "You're a bit like Gertrude," and I never forgot these words, "You're a bit like Gertrude Stein's Village Idiot. How can you exclude Wallace Stevens and James Merrill?" He was genuinely appalled. We're in a very different time now. Back then, I explained to John that politics mattered to me and alternative voices mattered to me. I wanted to include the as yet unincluded. And so today, I want to start by asking, why or how do writers become marginal? What does it mean to say they're alternative? Or to use one of Stevens' favorite perspectival techniques as Poe describes it, not Poe, Paul, that was a mistake. As Paul describes it in Love's Shadow, seeing from the circumference. Now, one of the most remarkable turns in Paul's book, which, as I said, held me in a slight suspension. It was a welcome and shimmering hold that helped me to counter the world that I'm living in down here in Nashville. And the thing that held me most was the chapter on the auroras of autumn. It contains a curious strategy of uplift, quite distinct from the wrought, overwrought unselving of a T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland. I want to quote Bové on the poem. "It is Stevens' great poem of poetic necessity, as it evokes from the imagination the greatest challenge to itself." And he continues, "Just what kind of poem is this? What are its aims? Which are its motives and resources?" These pages are the most alive for me. Perhaps because my metet, the master of my head, who possessed me first during one of my early trips to Haiti in my 20s, is the snake, Dambala, the serpent of sweet waters. He's a most demanding and jealous spirit. So I think that the beginning of Auroras of Autumn, which reworks the old and the dead into something that exceeds them, or what I'm going to read to you right here, right now. This is where the serpent lives, the bodiless. His head is air. Beneath his tip at night, eyes open and fix on us in every sky. Or is this another wriggling out of the egg, another image at the end of the cave, another bodiless for the body's sloth? Ritual is key, as Bové recognizes, throughout the auroras of autumn. We can begin, always in the interstices, to exist for, with, and through the all too fleshly in our midst. An aurora enfolds us. Bové asks how to legitimate or justify the use of an aesthetic device with deep ritualist and social value once Stevens has removed it from the armature and archive of poetic creation. That is the question. We are not to concern ourselves with the armature and archive of poetry, but rather the ritual and society out of which the aesthetic rudiments of Stevens' style are born. In his discussion of the auroras of autumn, Bové captures what St. Paul called the off-scouring of all things. Though he tells us Stevens is a secular poet, and I'm quoting, "The poet who writes on the dump is far more confidently creative, has a greater capacity to imagine in the face of ruin than the poet who reactively heaps broken images." So instead of shoring these fragments before his ruins, he uses them to create a ritual whereby ordinary words are handled, repeated, until they become extraordinary, something we have never seen, though we once knew the word. Bové asks in his meditation on the auroras of autumn, how to legitimate or justify the use of an aesthetic device with deep ritualist and social value. Let me repeat that. This is the question that faces us today as we think about reading and teaching Wallace Stevens. To read Stevens now, to face whiteness in the auroras of autumn, in the midst of the quiet and sometimes not so quiet interventions of the patriots and the oath keepers and the proud boys, how do we read these lines now and not tremble or squirm? Here, being visible is being white, is being of the solid of white, the accomplishment of an extremist in an exercise. And Bové makes sure we know that Stevens was a witness to the unbridled race hatred of his time, and I suspect he knew it would live on into another generation and another. It's America, after all. I want to turn to Canto 9, the sighting of what remains. I'm fascinated by Bové's treatment of the residue, what becomes in his chapter a kind of cult of the remnant. And here we read in Canto 9, the sighting of what remains. Shall we be found hanging in the trees next spring? Of what disaster is this the eminence? Bare limbs, bare trees, and a wind as sharp as salt. Salt in the wounds, salt in the welts left by the whip. That's me. I want to turn to an amazing section, again, of the chapter on auroras of autumn. where Paul takes our expectation of a poem or a work of art as a place that offers a kind of social value. He counters, the poet owes no social obligation. For many critics now, as in 1942 and other times, this is an intolerable and privileged claim. This marked a key turn in my reading, and I want to end with us considering what Bové might mean by social obligation, since so much of what I read here is a response to the social and an accounting for the value of self within the social, communal realm. I'm ending with a piece that he calls an interchapter. It's sandwiched in between the chapters on Adorno and the Auroras of Autumn. Bové turns here to Claudia Rankine and her long poem, Citizen, an American lyric. In an interview in the Paris Review, she speaks about the power of the unsaid. There's this subterranean exchange of context, emotions, and unspoken signals. That's what she wants us to think about. In her words, how white dominance is part of this invisible and unmarked dynamic. Bové then reflects on white privilege in words that I will never forget. It is a sodden haunt. It is killing and it is empty. And this is what he writes. The imagined world of white privilege is the deposited reality that pressures the poet as the consciousness of her audiences, a result of power's alliance with the long-term work of imagination in various institutions and interests. White privilege is a murderously ossified and actively resisted corrupted version of poetic work. It lacks love, the erotic. And saturated with fear, melancholically refuses a world reimagined. We are granted in Paul's work throughout his encounter with the feel of transport, a voice making its way into, and I would say that it's a manner of possession, a word that I have stayed with for a very long time. Words, the logos, to be in the word, and to know that there you have the mystery of faith. You experience a discipline that's that of belief. So though this is secular, though we are dealing perhaps with something called a secular poet, as Adorno would say, you don't speak it if you are it. The thing that you think most powerfully becomes you is the thing that you remain silent about. So let me end with the final thought I have as I kept reading, going back to the Auroras of Autumn itself. I asked this question, and I think Stevens answers it. What would belief be like if it were as absolute, as real as a fist to the stomach? Thank you.
Thank you for that very incredibly rich presentation. Don, please, would you unmute?
First of all, I want to congratulate Paul Bové on this remarkable accomplishment, and to thank Nergie for putting together this session. I have not read a work of, in quotes, literary criticism that I found as enlivening and as provocative as Love Shadow since I first read Northrop Frye's Fearful Symmetry. It's a work that is designed to call attention to the relationship between the possible loss of poiesis and the threat to the species of the human as such. And it designates a primary antagonism, the relationship between the rule of melancholia organized by allegoresis and what Bové calls secular anagogus, designed to produce a perspective on that rule that will enable its displacement by an act of poetic imagination. As we read this work, discover the ways in which the notion of allegoresis, which seems to be localized within the crisis of Europe initially, and a certain cadre of fellow scholars, soon envelops not only the Judeo-Christian tradition, but Western philosophy. I want to talk about the way in which that change of scale is also what, in a certain way, legitimates Bové's claim that the future of the human species is itself at stake in this agonism. Paul Bové says he wrote Love's Shadow after recognizing that the relations between poiesis and criticism, essential to the making and sustaining of the historically human, had fallen into disrepair beyond a veil of ruin and redemption from above that he associates with the transcendental imagination, which is inhuman, and the rule of allegory. The theory of poiesis Paul vivifies in Love's Shadow offers a subtle account of imaginative intelligence itself as a species function of the human, in relation not to infinity or the transcendental, but in relation to its own finitude and the so-called external or natural world, an autonomy which is evidenced in the imagination's capacity to survive what Bové calls the pressures of the real, pressures that are increasingly intensified by the expanding rule of the field of melancholia. Criticism, the primary human relation to this imaginative intelligence, is essential to sustain the species history and identity and responsibility in any habitat, real or conceived. Without critics committed to learn from and defend imaginative achievement, that is, the ongoing affiliation of works of what he calls masterful poiesis, the species' capacity for poiesis itself is vulnerable to dissipation in the temporal postponement of utopian allegoresis. Now, these terms need to be thought about because the agonism that Bové is constructing is an agonism that also legitimates many of his claims about the critic's position in the circumference in order, through an act of critical poiesis, to become aware of the way in which poets such as Rankin can displace this melancholic real with an alternative act of the poetic imagination, a real that Bové associates with not only white privilege, but the rule of melancholia associated with that saturating logic. I'm going to give you some sense of the stakes of the book by just talking about the strategy he deploys from the opening chapter, where he makes clear that the ambit of this project is not an effort to offer some new reading that can be turned into a new schema that will allow literary scholars to say they have an understanding of the high schematic, as Adorno would put it, that allows for an association of Shalom, Schmidt, Benjamin, and the Elohist tradition, although he discusses this matter at greater length throughout the work. But Bové, I'm reading off my computer, and this oftentimes, but he is interested, quite interested, in clarifying how Frederick Jameson's assemblage of decisive interpretations of these affiliative relations supplies a locus classicus for the utopian allegoresis that Bové holds responsible for the melancholic amnesia, bogus messianism, temporal deferral, evasion of historicality, disavowal of human finitude, which has brought about the ruination of the field of literary studies. Put too crudely, allegoresis is a displacement of the power of poesy itself to replace, or rather reimagine, its prior imaginings, with reading according to the power of the interpreter to discover secret meanings or transcendental signifieds that accrues authority for the critic, but loses the power of poesis that Bové is intent on revivifying in this work. I can't get my pages are freezing now. Love Shadow lays out a devastating critique of the intellectual assumptions of allegoresis. He animates this critique as an element in the antagonistic relation between utopian allegoresis and secular anagogy. He utilizes the fourth level of interpretation that Dante laid out in his account of the Divine Comedy in order to call attention to the position that the poet occupies that can't be associated with the transcendental imagination, but is instead the locus classicus for what it is that experiences the pressure of the real in order to be provoked, not in order to generate a new allegorical form, but a reimagining of the human realm itself. Upon describing poetry as an archive of the human effort to establish the species' dreams and desires, Bové depicts the stakes of this agonism as involving the survival of the species. In the anagogic tradition, Bové restores. He offers an alternative, as an alternative to allegoresis, the poet as the location of the imagination's work of creating, the alternatives needed to guide the species out of this ruination. To accomplish this work, the poet enacts the imaginative intelligence that is, in the most material sense, he claims, the love and freedom resident in the materiality of the species itself as it changes and lives in time. The primary assumption of Bové's imaginative gamble is that the subject of poetry is not a subject that can be related to any particular locale. It's the collective force and desire and judgment and power of valuation of the human species itself, which is why he's suggesting that this work can apply to a reader, all readers anywhere who wish to supplant a tyrannical regime with a poetic reimagining that can restore vitality to life itself. Criticism like Fred Jameson's, which regards literature as the conception of nature being imitated by a corresponding order of words. That's the basis for his allegoresis. Believes itself to continue an authoritative account of literature's allegorical truth. But this understanding of literature, as Bové points out, is very reductive. Unlike allegoresis, anagogy is a quality of poesy rather than a method of reading. When we take anagogy seriously, we see that it involves the capacity to replace the real that presses upon it with its own alternatives that not only displace the given, but create a new world in the imaginations of all. Bové's subject, first chapter, suggests a relatively localized temporality for melancholic allegorists. It is the long epoch of the European crisis as it has been subsumed by contemporary literary scholars. The second chapter extends this genealogy to the Eloist tradition that Auerbach exposits in his exercises in comparative philology. Bové constantly positions himself in the catachristic position between the genealogies he's discerning and the philologies that call attention to the style and the effect of those ways of life. And in the remarkable third chapter, to which Paul already alluded, he affiliates Benjamin's Origins of the German Trauerspiel with a comparable reconfiguration of the positioning of tragedy, poetry, and philosophy in Plato's Symposium, which in this work becomes an antecedent for Benjamin's understanding of the play of tragedy. When Plato replaced the poet with the philosopher as the figure chiefly responsible for the enactment of reliable, imaginative human efforts in the world, he added the Symposium to the crisis in Europe, the Eloist tradition, in the network of affiliations of allegoresis. In Plato's own terms, thereby successfully established that only philosophy can fulfill human life by showing that the path to truth alone satisfies desire. Eros, which is displaced from the body onto the activity of truth. Eros, which is ontologically fundamental to the human itself, undergoes a radical dissipation of value. Socrates' strategic positioning within his dialogues thereafter provide the paradigm for modern allegorists to appeal to esoteric knowledge, which can become available to others only through them. As an aside, this setting serves as the mise en scène for the agonistic relations that will ensue throughout the remaining chapters, in which Bové brings together Stephen's positioning of the poet as superior to the philosopher in his account of the necessary angel. He introduces Benjamin as a means of undermining the method of cross-examination and dialogue through which Socrates achieved his hegemony. And he introduces through Shakespeare the power of comedy and romance to undermine the rule of tragedy that Aristophanes attempted to inaugurate in the Symposium. Each chapter that follows opens a pathway out from under the shadow of this tradition of melancholic ruination. Adorno in the essay, Stevens in poetry, Rembrandt in painting, Shakespeare in comedy and romance. Individually and collectively, these figures regain the authority of the imagination and offer strong alternatives, poetic alternatives to the melancholic amnesia and the correlated figures of ruination upon which modern criticism has built its own messianic, apocalyptic, allegorical, and revolutionary utopian practices. The Auroras of autumn, Adorno's essays, Rembrandt's Bathsheba at her bath, Shakespeare's As You Like It in The Winter's Tale, not only have agency, each and together instantiate poiesis, an ontological characteristic of human life as historically active in creating the world and itself through the processes of poetic imagination. These works offer secular evidence of humanity's sufficiency in the finite struggles to live as mortals within an often imperfect world. Now, the claim that poiesis creates the world means far more than the poem provides names to the world. The poet imagines the world as a reality that has a place in the human mind dreaming that it contains even the nature that seems to contain it as a force of the imagination, as a thing the mind can conceive, including, of course, the place of the human within this world, which itself resides in the makings of poets' imaginations. The building of a world from the foundations is one essential goal of anagogic work. Another is to fulfill the poet's claim to be the habitus of such transformative work in the material reality of human life and practice. Bové's thinking has brought him to a basic insight about poetry and poetics. Reality and its pressures cannot constrain the species' ability to imagine the criteria remade to meet human desires. Poiesis ferments alternative dreams that would take up nature itself so as to reimagine against the centrist reality that is now monopolizing and tyrannizing the understanding of the human real. Because they begin and risk and emphasize the capacity of thought to engage with superfluity of secular finitude, it's Adorno's essays that bear a family resemblance to Bové's Love's Shadow. In giving this account of Love's Shadow, I have risked converting the work itself into an allegory to be interpreted. But Bové suggests in introducing the category of anagogus that it is impossible for a poem to be transposed into a text that can be interpreted by an expert reader. Poiesis is a means of creating an alternative to the real that when itself becomes the world we inhabit by way of our imagination, that can only be displaced by an alternative poiesis. I want to conclude by asking Paul a question. In this account of allegoresis and its relationship to anagogy, allegoresis seems to occupy two very different positions. On the one hand, it occupies a position that can polemically be critiqued by a critic. On the other hand, allegoresis also becomes itself a creation of the poetic imagination, what you call poison, that only the poetic imagination has the capacity at once to engage and to transform. If allegoresis can occupy that double positioning, can Benjamin's remarkable work on Novus Angelus itself be described as an effort poetically to reimagine the conditions of his finitude?
Thank you so much, Don. Might we, just in terms of time, is this a good point to, you said you had the question Shall we move on to Dr. West, or you need a couple?
I understood that to be the question.
I understood too, so perhaps it's a good moment for Dr. West. Thank you so much for walking.
Either way is fine with me. I just want to thank you guys. These two powerful reflections on Brother Paul's marvelous and magnificent and magisterial text. I want to begin though on a note that takes us down memory lane. I see my dear sister, Professor Diane, and her reflections and memories at Princeton, Gail Pemberton and others. I see Brother Don going back now 44 years, most recently at Dartmouth, always being so kind and loving to me. Sister Nergie, this is the first time, Professor Erturk, I've got a chance to meet you, but you got that rich connection with Turkey with my daughter and others. And Brother Paul, one of the great joys in my life is being able to be your brother and your colleague and your comrade. When we first met 44 years ago there in Hamilton Hall, your office right next to Edward Zaid, and calling every other day to our dear, dear, dear brother William Spanos, who we shall never, ever, ever forget. Joseph Buttigieg, Jonathan Herrick, Michael Haynes, our dear brother Danny at Temple. What's his last name? What's Brother Danny's last name?
O'Hara.
O'Hara. Yeah, I want to get the whole name in. No, but these for me are very important, especially for the audience, because this is the magnum opus of Paul Bové, who has a common denominator of being fundamentally, existentially invested in defending intellectual vocation, defending the calling of being a thinker and a critic, and always wedded in defending poetic imagination, but rooted in, immersed in forms of Geschichtlichkeit, of historicity. So when we first met, it was destructive poetics, it was Heidegger, it was Beckett, it was immersed in temporality and historicity. Then Intellectuals in Power and the Genealogy of Critical Humanism. Lo and behold, we got to say something about commodification of the academy. You got to say something about the professionalization and the specialization of literary criticism. You got to say something about the more routinized forms of melancholia, which are too cheap and not costly, that become a matter of intellectually skating rather than a matter of adventure in the Whiteheadian sense, that noble discontent, that critical discontent that the great Alfred North Whitehead begins with adventures. And Paul Bové has always had one foot in the best of that discourse of vocation, calling, imagination in all of its various forms and historicity, but he's also got this very hypersensitivity and hyper solidarity with the wretched of the earth. So he's not going to be seduced by nomenclatures. He's not going to be seduced by terminologies that make gestures in a leftist direction when they are themselves being re-bureaucratized and recirculated in such a way that it creates a distance from the very creativity, which cuts deeper than agency. This is not just about agency. No. It cuts deeper than that. It has to do with the improvisational, experimental, fluid, flexible, anti-dogmatic sensibility of a species trying to make it in time and space. That's something different. And so it's fascinating to see Brother Paul go through these different transformations and reiterations. My fundamental question for Brother Paul is to give us just a very, very brief characterization of your own genealogy from this destructive poetics to Love's Shadow, where we end up with my favorite painter, Rembrandt himself. Oh my God, I wish we had about 4 hours for Rembrandt. because I got an hour and a half reading of that last great painting, Return of the Prodigal Son, and just as you're reading of Bathsheba. What is it about Rembrandt that allows him to defend the vocation, to enact the vocation, to defend the imagination, to embody the imagination at a particular moment where he is at the top in terms of fame and fortune, and then boom, finds himself having to sell his own paintings in order to preserve his own family, and yet still committed to life of the mind, world of ideas, vocation, thinking, poesis, and so forth. At the same time, though, I think it was a deeply unsettling text for me, because when Brother Lindy asked me to read it for Harvard, I said, oh, shoot. Anytime I get a chance to read Paul Bové, I'll do it. Now, you got 900 pages, so I only got one life to live. I said, well, okay, I'll do it. And I read every page, and it made a big difference in my life, like so many of his other texts have done. But he was attacking my own tradition in one sense, because Benjamin and Lukács and Jameson have meant the world to me. And I can't conceive of myself without dealing with their ways of connecting commodification, reification, wrestling with melancholia, left melancholia, coming to terms with critiques of various forms and genres, and still trying to somehow stay afloat. And it had something to do with this gravitas of catastrophe. And what do you do with catastrophe? And my second question, I'm going to be very brief, but my second question, Brother Paul, is I wonder whether my beloved Chekhov is just waiting for you to come in his direction, because he seems to be able to talk about the catastrophic in such a way that he doesn't fall into any of the traps of routinized melancholy. He's got a sad soul and a cheerful disposition. Yes, he does. But he also goes beyond just agency. He also goes beyond just the labels and goes beyond just the narrow characterizations of what these days people would call, identity groups and so forth. That he knows he's Ukrainian, he knows he's Russian. He's willing to take a stand in defense of Dreyfus and lose all of his Russian friends. He's willing to make his stances vis-a-vis patriarchy and still have to call into question elements inside of him, his own self. But he doesn't in any way give up on his vocation or give up on his defense of poetic imagination. And if that's true, then we've got Rembrandt, Rosalind, As You Like It, not Touchstone, not wit without love, as Harold Godard would put it. No. This is more than wit. This is more than smartness. This is more than professional status. This is more than fame and the neoliberal university. This is what it means to be a human being who takes the life of the mind seriously and is committed to the best of what the species has been able to generate in terms of empowering the least of these. I'm using the biblical term now. So I wonder, my dear brother, and this is, of course, a conversation that we have been going at it for 40 years. I recall our conference on hermeneutics at Union Seminary in 1979 in the Union Theological Seminary journal. And we've been wrestling with this. Vico's deeper than Heidegger. He's talking about corpses. He's not just talking about abstract conceptions of death. And Wazaid, Hayden White, and Rube Harrison, and Eric Auerbach are the great students of Vico. There's a sense in which Bové is in this very trajectory too, it seems to me. But briefly, one's own genealogy based on the common denominator that I've talked about. And lastly, whether Chekhov in particular, and I do detect at times a certain hesitancy and reluctance to want to come to terms with the Russians. And by Russians in the larger context, as you know, I'm talking about the blues in the New World context. Now the blues, Paul's got a whole lot of implicit and explicit reference to the blues, but as it takes form in Chekhov and the other great Russian writers, Akhmatov and a host of others, that's another side question I have, but I'm going to bring it to a close because we're here to have dialogue, and I'm just so blessed to be here. And of course, we got to mention Sister Carol. There's no Paul Bové without Sister Carol, and blessed daughter too. But I won't get too personal and biographical at the moment. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Dr. West. Paul, I'll ask you to address the panel's questions, but in the meantime, I wanted to also invite our attendees to pose questions. You can use the Q&A feature. You can also use the raise hand icon, and I'll unmute you. So I see Rob Wilson. Rob, I'm allowing you to talk, so that should, Rob, please go ahead.
Oh, do you want me to go before?
Let's take perhaps a couple of questions if you're ready, and then ask Paul to respond to all of these. And so if you're ready, we can do that.
I am ready. Can you hear me okay?
It's a little bit difficult to hear you. Can you? Let's see. Let's try again.
Okay, wait. I might have. I think I have to turn off the Bluetooth.
It's
Now or no?
How are you, Paul, in terms of hearing Rob? Are you able to hear him well, or is it just
I
me?
hear the slightest mumble.
Okay, yeah, we're all hearing, I think.
It's talking about belief in theopoetics and Stephen. For the place of Colin Dayan and Cornel West. Can you hear that or no?
We're not.
Oh,
Right.
I heard one or two words. I heard Colin's name and I heard the word belief, I think, but the rest, I'm afraid, Rob, was still a mumble for me here.
Oh.
Rob, may I switch your okay, Mark is weighing in. Let's come back to Rob. Rob, would you be okay if I change your status to attendee?
Yes.
Okay, let's see if that works. In the meantime, feel free to, others who wish to speak or ask questions. So I'm promoting you to panelist. So let's see if that helps. If not, so we should all be able to see Rob now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
No, it's not helping.
I think he's asking about the controversy between Cornel West and Kanye.
Okay.
But in the it's mentioned in the Wallace Stevens chapter. I think that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mentioned Kanye West.
Not Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think. Yeah.
Oh, Ta-Nehisi Coates, did I?
No,
This
I'm
is one of my passing remarks about hope. This is Cornell and I have had this argument about hope for decades.
You still can't hear me. Nothing.
It's not great. Maybe maybe it would help to sort of take off the headphones. That might make a difference. And speak Are you still connected? Yeah. Paul, are you able to hear?
No, I'm hearing merely a mumble. I don't know if
I think
anyone
it's
else
best if you if it's possible for you to use the Q&A feature. That might work the best. Sorry.
Why don't I try to answer the first set of questions?
Yeah, let's. And in the
Rob
meantime, that sounds good.
Trying to rearrange his tech for us.
That makes sense.
Thanks, the three of you, for the honor of paying attention to what I've done. It's such a remarkable array of responses too. The way in which the responses to the book have been coming to me has been very interesting. At first, all of the inaugural responses had to do, Cornell, with Rembrandt. And in fact, the interview in the Boston Globe was all about the Rembrandt chapter, and the now canceled Columbia University seminar on literary theory was on the Rembrandt chapter, and people want to talk with me about the Rembrandt chapter. Very much more recently, people want to talk about the Socrates chapter, the interlude. Dan O'Hara, whom Corn mentioned a little while ago, has emailed me, and I know he's a careful reader of Stevens and therefore of that chapter. But until Colin today raised the issue of the Auroras of Autumn in public, as far as I know, no one has spoken regarding the book about the Auroras of Autumn. And I have a tendency to believe that that fact proves to some extent one of the contentions of the book, which is that folks would much more likely do other things than pay attention to or try to read poetry. So that's something I note, and I'm also extremely flattered, honored by Colin's careful and close remaking and retelling of that, whose remarks, Colin's remarks, also give me a chance to perhaps link back to something about the nature of imagination, and then something to the longer genealogical questions that Cornell's asking about, and that is, how is it that the poet is not obliged to the social? That remark, as I recall, Colin, comes in the context of discussing a series of history of criticism from people on various forms of the left, beginning with the Masses magazine, right, challenging him for being less than directly and openly part of the immediate class struggles. And that position on Stevens, of course, has evolved until recent years through Rita Dove's minimalization of Wallace Stevens in the Anthology of American and Modern Poetry, which she produced, that created the big debate with Helen Wendler in the pages of the New York Review of Books. What I am after, of course, is something like what many of you have specified, which is the fact that the work of imagination, and I don't want it to be a transcendental quality, I want it to be a name for, in fact, a species, an almost ontological species capacity to reimagine, to remake, to do work that is other than, to press back against. I want that to be understood to be so fundamental that to declare out of bounds some work because it is not in conformity with what must be, although well-motivated, passionate, and crucial for its commitments to what we would now call social and class justice, racial justice, and so on, is nonetheless quite likely to be doing damage to the fundamental processes that are not only embodied in a great work of art, poetic art, like that of Stevens and the Auroras of Autumn, but more importantly, the work of such alternative creativities wherever they happen to be, from the streets of activism to the classroom, to the work of science, to the work of politicians, to the work of art, to the intellectual vocations. In fact, to certain, I'll put it that way, certain pulpits, right? That capacity, which I am calling imagination, finds for me a usefully specific and particular home in the work of art and in the work done by artists, poets, painters, and so on and so forth. But it is not resident only in such people, right? And the problem, however, is that when the intellectual classes essentially do the business of the dominant forms of reality, even in the name, right, of the appeals to progress, progressivism, and so on and so forth, right, they can be doing considerable damage to the foundational capacities which you would find, if you will, in a Chekhov, in a Vico, in a Stevens, right? Indeed, even in an Emerson, foundational possibilities which are constrained, commanded, and I'll use a Schmittian term here, directed, right, by forces that are, no matter how we weigh the questions of justice, gathering to themselves power. So the question then becomes, what's the relation between, here we go back to your Chekhov Russian question. How do we think about the relationship between what I'm calling imagination as this generalized capacity of the species on the one hand, and power, which is another capacity, in the name of which, of course, what I'm calling imagination can serve. And here's to pick up the question of poison, right? The imagination is perfectly capable of generating neoliberal corporate administrative structures, for instance. No doubt about that. It can put in place all kinds of narrative, aesthetic, and formal structural impediments, which are easily established, repeated, circulated, and so on, and lack, therefore, the critical vocational elements, the creative vocational elements, which the residence of which and the value and persistence of which throughout the species as definitional to the species survival, right, needs to be more fundamentally defended than almost anything else, right? So I don't know if I've tied some of your questions together, but I've tried. And apropos Chekhov, Cornell, you wrote to me what happened to Beckett. And you will remember there's in my desk, there's an unpublished 280-page book on Beckett. The late novels of whom, of course, would be representative of what you're calling the Russian questions as well. And I'll just add one other quick thing on the question of the vocation, back to the Rankine, over again to the long issue of poison. I recall, and picking up on the question of the social, as Colin surfaces it in the context of whiteness, right? In that great poem of the Auroras of Autumn, it's the white played against the snow. It's the shades of white, right? Over and over again. Not only is Rankine relevant there, but elsewhere, close to there, I talk about Baldwin, right? And Baldwin making two statements, which I think are relevant here. One is after his meeting in Chicago with Muhammad, he says, Elijah Muhammad, he says, I am primarily a writer. I will not stay here in Chicago. I will leave. And he goes wherever he goes in Chicago to what he insists is his integrated world. Right? So that's one thing that matters, because for him, the writing is more important than the commitment or the allure of the call of justice, which in a very crude way, you will remember, he calls that allure of justice stupidity. It's a very difficult kind of moment. And talking about it has led people to say to me, well, Baldwin, he's the white man's favorite black writer. I'm sure you've all heard that phrase in some form or another. But the pressure in a Baldwin, as well as in a Rankine, as well as in a Stevens, right, to defend these Chekhovian foundational matters, while, as in the case of William Carlos Williams as well, being a gynecologist, a practicing physician, and so on and so forth, right? These are all part of the intermixtures of the play of what I'm calling imagination here. Anyway, thank you. I went on for too long. Sorry.
We have about 2 minutes. You also have a question from Jason Fitzgerald in the Q&A forum. Can you see it?
Yes, I was going to just speak to that before we turn to Jason. I appreciate your questions, Jason, because I did have a question for Paul, and which was nagging at me the entire time I was reading. What about the non-human? I mean, because the emphasis on the human, and I would like you to talk a little bit about, I mean, the non-human is so crucial to Stevens' work, the inanimate, but the thing that is not human. So I'm just wondering if you would speak a little bit about the emphatic human. That was my only overweening kind of question throughout. The centrality that you grant in Stevens' work to the human when there's so much else going on, one might say.
I was certainly aware of the long history of, well, recent history, let's say, which has now grown long, of the critique of the anthropos, the critique of the anthropocentric. Right? And there isn't any doubt that I am trying to reconfigure a notion of humanism in such a way that it incorporates those concerns. I am, throughout this book and elsewhere, suspicious of an oppositional rhetoric that takes its objections as being effectively those which can erase other long-standing and often quite productive traditions. So to be aware, for example, that climate change is a result of an anthropocentric willful disaster, willed disaster in carbon science and so on and so forth, is one thing. To object to anthropocentrism because of its inability to pay attention to what is not human, well, I say back to that. I point in return to that objection, I point to Colin Dayan, who is a humanist.
Let me clarify something.
Yeah.
I never use the word Anthropocene. I don't talk about, that is not something that I'm trying to move forward, in questioning. I was just curious. I wanted you to just ruminate on Stevens and what is not human in the poetry. That was
Yes.
all.
I'm trying, I understand. I'm trying in a way to answer Jason's question, which I think has pushed me more towards this issue than your original comment did.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, because I do think Stevens, the answer I'm giving is equivalent to an answer I used to give years ago when I had done the Intellectuals in Power book. And I used to have this argument with Said all the time, used to say, well, Foucault is not a humanist. But that was an ideological claim. By that he meant, Foucault would not embrace whatever it was that Edward believed humanism to be as a matter of ideological discourse and practice. But, from any point of view, I think that we can represent concerning scholarship and inquiry. Foucault was a humanist. He was interested in the question, what is the human? How is knowledge produced? How does power operate? And so on and so forth, okay? We can say that. So that the category humanist is not necessarily entrapped by objections to the historical category of humanism, all that aside. But inside Stevens, sure, not only is there attention to the human and what I will call, and here I don't like this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, the ethical dimension of imaginative, what I'm calling imaginative capacity, as far as I know it located in the human species, the ethical responsibility for the life of that species in a habitat for which it has considerable responsibility, upon which it has had inordinate effect. So that's one thing that concerns me. But also in the poetry itself, as you're saying, Colin, there's not only a concern for those things which, to come back to your word possession, are not evidently restricted by the category of the human as a material reality, but it's also a poetry which is exquisitely attentive, thinking of that jar in Tennessee, for example, right, to objects and to creatures, many of them purely mythological, like snowmen, right, who possess all sorts of qualities towards which it is the task and possibility of that thing I'm calling imagination resident in the human species, right, to be able to summon for us all that which is not explicitly human. Right. But in the book, you may remember this, I talk about Virgil's great eclogue on the bees, right? And the interesting thing to me about that, not only in Virgil, but even elsewhere in Stevens himself, is that the metaphor of the bees, which compares the building of the city of Carthage to the way in which bees work to build a hive, this kind of false analogy between the non-human and the human dissolves entirely, because the entire way in which the human imagination attempts to represent the non-human is already thoroughly all anthropomorphized, so that it can become a way of representing the non-human in modalities that the human understands, perceives, and can duplicate, right? So that's a deep and profound concern, but it's related to the larger anagogical question in the book, which I admit that I have in many ways stolen from Northrop Frye, although I don't accept his Miltonic weight in stealing it. The idea that what is happening in the human imagination is not only a remaking of the world so that it conforms to the dream of the human, but also that the human dreams the world as if it were already made by the human. And it is in that kind of dialectical space that even I think the most seriously attentive human imagination has to be, within limits, of course, that are defining, and when it tries to think the question of what is the not human, right? Because it has already dreamt the not human. And so it forces upon us, as in your work, Colin, the careful attention to what happens with dogs as biological creatures, dogs in streets, dogs as humans, as criminals, so-called, right, in the prison system, and dogs as in the poems of William Carlos Williams, so that the entire spectrum of the human and not human is all within this thing, the imagination and the critical intelligence give us, right, as the sphere of the habitus in which, among other things, the human is aware of itself as a species dwelling, when it also becomes aware of itself as that which it can modify, and that which in its activities causes enormous modifications upon that which it understands itself not to be. And in understanding itself not to be, to go back to your work, it understands itself not to be dog. Yes, which is a mistake, yes, fundamental. So I don't know if that answers Jason's question or picks up on yours, but I want to hold the category of the human because I find it almost impossible, here's a terrible word, to imagine escaping it. And finding, that in the work of the great humanists, as Cornell reminds us, and Cornell and I, many years ago in the Casa Italiana in Colombia, when somebody was busy shooting at Cornell with rifle bullets, and he turns to me and says, "You sure you want to sit next to me at this moment?" Without consulting in a conference honoring Edward Said, whose health was very bad at that moment, we both began speaking about Vico. And Cornell, being Cornell, was speaking about love, and I, being me, was speaking about corpses. And the permanent conjunction, of a long tradition of thought that has these skills of reflection, philology, poesis, imagination, and commitment to continuing a project that is ongoing, but without being despairing, melancholic, quick, aligned too easily with power, and so on and so forth. That work has to continue going on. And it's what we love and we accept and we realize and are satisfied with, despite the fact that it is merely life. And we've gone over time, Nergie.
We are over time, but it's so rare to have you all in one virtual room or in real room. So I think that's okay. Rob has followed up on chat, Paul. So if you're able to sort of weigh in on that, but I also wanted to give Colin, Don, and Cornell, an opportunity if they wanted to follow up on the question, Jason's question, or any of the conversation that's sort of any of Paul's remarks. Before we conclude.
I just want to point out that Paul, in one of his articulations of the realm of melancholy, describes it as an effort to escape the human. So that would be an instance in which that is dreamt by some humans.
Yes.
I think Sister Colin had a last point. I could see it.
Yeah, you see it.
I see it.
I have been looking at Rob Wilson's. He finally made he's got a comment in the chat, and it's a question about belief. And so I'll just read it. Paul, can you tell more about Wallace Stevens' struggle with belief from Sunday morning to and through final soliloquy of Interior Paramour, with the claim that we say God and the imagination are one? Stevens was baptized on deathbed in Hartford twice, which is impossible. Wendler denies this, but the relevant text here is to an old philosopher in Rome, and Santayana on his deathbed in Rome, surrounded by nuns and the greater of the church. In any case, let me just stop there, and maybe Paul, you could talk to us a little bit about the matter of belief, which is something, and faith, but those terms, more terms here, but.
Thank you for that. I can do it even without Wallace Stevens, perhaps a little more briefly. And I say without Wallace Stevens for actually, if I can be allowed to use this phrase, a methodological reason, because nowhere in the book do I really try to talk about, I never tried to talk about a work as if it is the expression of an actually living, breathing creator in the world, right? Because that's not part of the philological dimension that I'm interested in. I'm not interested in the biophilological, but in the Vickian sense of the use of language and troping. So I don't know what to say about Stevens himself as having a struggle with belief, although I think it's possible to read the poems as giving evidence of the fact that in them there is a struggle with the questions of belief. But in one of the issues in Love's Shadow is really to say, I suppose, that while it's almost never the case that I quote my namesake, but I will here, the greatest of these is love, he says, right? Not faith and hope. But if we're pushed to the question, I would say faith rather than hope. Right? So I would say belief. Although belief for me would be a secular term that names, again, something like a species requirement. And now I'm thinking of Georges Canguilhem, a species requirement of a kind of necessary set of beliefs as concepts that do the evolutionary work for societies, for groups, and I guess you could extend to say for the species. Understanding that those things in which there is belief are transient, right? But need nonetheless to be held. So the poisonous nature of the real as a result of the imagined is the deadliness of not belief, but of automatism and iteration, right? As opposed to the activism, the active nature of belief, which is attached to love and is inseparable from creativity and critique, critical reflection, knowledge, study, regard, respect. Somewhat different than experiment. But also different from, I believe, foundationally different from the idea of hope, voiced, for example, paradigmatically for me by Jameson as that which is over the horizon somewhere else. That is to say, for belief doesn't contain this quality of temporal deferral from struggle, creativity, and love and immediacy, right? To its delayed postponement of gratification. I mean, that kind of block-in crudity, it seems to me, is behind certain notions of hope is unsatisfactory. That's not to say all forms of hope are unsatisfactory, but that is unsatisfactory. So I think I would come back to the question of belief there. Now, certainly in Stevens, I mean, in some of the very great poems, like the one I quote, what is the issue in the Man on the Dump? It's finding the, right? If you can find the, this then becomes the possibility of belief as much as it becomes the strength of these ontological capacities of imagination and intelligence, let's say, call them that, right? Not to be overwhelmed by the detritus and the ruins left and deposited as the real by previous activities of imagination, and so on and so forth, which seemingly are effective because they're buttressed in and formed as power and iteration, but are evolutionarily, if we can use that as a word, right, completely fatal to the possibility of the species and its habitat.
But Brother Paul, there is a question, though, of the relation of Wallace's prose with his poetry. I mean, it's one thing for him to say the self and the sun are one, or when he's talking about children and the bones and the postcard from the volcano or the planet on the table, those bequeath poems, those legacy poems, that's closer to where he is as opposed to the free play of mind and intelligence and words that's going on somewhere else. But when we get to the Princeton address of 1941, the noble writer, the sounds of words, and he says, poetry helps us to live. And that belief is, and here we learn from Cavell. Remember, Cavell makes a distinction between retail skepticism and wholesale skepticism that he gets from Dewey, really. But you know, Stanley's genius is so capacious that he's recycling that in that way. But retail melancholia and wholesale melancholia are two different things. And if it's understood in that way, then it's a contextualizing and a provisionalizing of skepticism or melancholy or whatever it is. So that, I mean, part of Fred's problem is he's a totalizer. I mean, he's Hegel. He's got to totalize, historicize, always already. Okay, Brother Fred, we appreciate the insights, but it's still going to be too allegorical for you and a host of others. But when Wallace Stevens does make the claim that poetry is a means of redemption, you know, that's got some overtones that's hard to downplay, though, brother. And it's in the face of death, in the capacity of the species to be able to live, owing to the notion of poesis that Brother Don laid out so well and Sister Colin laid out so well. Does that make sense, though, brother?
It does make sense, but you remember that context. He is saying, he is laying out for the Princeton faculty and deans a program in poetry studies, which one of his rich friends intends to fund.
Was that Henry Church?
Yeah. And then he says, poetry is not the body of poems that's been written. Poetry is not a method or technique for the use of language that can be taught and studied. Right. Poetry is in that essay in the Princeton. It's not only in that one, it's also in the somewhat later talk he gives at Columbia in the English Institute when it was still at Columbia. Mm-hmm. Poetry is this capacity. Mm-hmm. I don't know what other word. This is why we come up against this issue, this term, which still matters, and which I steal from Van Gogh in talking about the Rembrandt, right? Mystery. Now, if you want to in any way hear the echoes of sacralization, or to use Colin's word, possession, right, in the word redemption, then you would have to hear it as well in Van Gogh's use of the word mystery, right, to confront the Bathsheba in her bath, right? However, my point is quite specifically and in a limited sense this, philologically aware as we are of the genealogy that gives authority to certain patterns of expectation and that inscribes certain words within certain discourses, we are still free to say no. All right. So I do not hear a sacralized sense in the category, in the term redemption. There, okay. Right? Because redemption simply names the same thing I am elsewhere calling, because I have no other word, imagination. Right? Now, Colin, in my hearing, with the word possession, is really talking the body, the street, experience, affect, right? And it is certainly true that in experiences which we could call otherwise religious, spiritual, ritualistic, they're modalities of possession, right? And I am completely grateful to Colin for recognizing that my account of the auroras of autumn, right, is as the aesthetic solutions to the dangers posed by imagination as it almost inescapably reproduces itself in myth and ritual. Right? And so therefore there's always the possibility of possession. There's always the possibility, not only the possibility, but the necessity for what he there is calling redemption, right? But it's not, to use a terrible term here, it's not godly, or it's no more. How about if we quote Goya when asked the question, what are the influences upon your art? Goya's answer was God and Rembrandt. Right. So if those two words can designate effectively the same. Right. And somewhere in there, I think Colin alluded to it briefly. It is also the case that I take Stevens as being writing back against the opening of John's Gospel. Right. So, and therefore writing back against Bill Spanos too on the incarnational aesthetic, if you want to bring Bill back into life.
It's a beautiful, beautiful work, Paul. Just
thank you, Paul.
Rich, I'm telling you.
Kind of all of you
Wonderful
who have
work.
spoken, and all of you who have offered questions and have not only come, but some of you have actually stayed.
Congratulations, Paul, again, and thank you all for
Thank
this
you all.
incredibly rich conversation. And this is a very typical Boundary 2 event that always goes beyond the scheduled time. So,
unlike the best Boundary 2 events, it's not going down in a bar with a bottle of bourbon or something.
yes, there's no whiskey at the end. But
That's true.
I think on this note, then let's conclude. Thank you all. It's really, truly an honor and a pleasure. And congratulations, Paul.
Thank you. And Nergie, you and I will stay for a moment and talk.
Absolutely. So we'll,
thank you to everyone, and especially thank you to
thank you
Don,
for
and
all
Colin,
your
and
time.
Cornell, and
Absolutely.
people who have been part of what I call in the book my own private Republic of Letters for a very long time.
Absolutely.
From the moment when Cornell said to me, I think in 1976, I hear you believe in history. And then to the next moment at Union Theological Seminary when Don arrived to debate Cornell about Kierkegaard. And then Colin came in to bring us all down to the proper level of that, which is so arrogant as to think itself merely human. Thank you all.
Paul.
And there.
I'll say hello to you and Don.
Yes.
Love you guys.
Hello, Axel.
Okay, thank you again.
Thanks to all of you very much.
Indeed.
Very well during the remainders of this pandemic, please.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely.
Hopefully next year we'll meet at Dartmouth. We'll drink.
And the drinks are on me. Drinks are on
yours.
me.
Better yet. Good night, all. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Oh, stay strong. Love you, love you, love you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Well, perhaps pausing the recording at this point would be a good one.